Uh, Bienvenida, Embajador. You are most welcome in our international relation workshop. We were just waiting for you. We now hand over. My name is Franz Baleni. We have Central Committee members, PP officials, and members of this International Relations Commission and provincial representative as well. You're welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Conrad. Can you listen to me well?
I can hear you very well, yeah.
First of all, let me say that I apologize because it's not possible for me to stay there during the whole session. My time is very limited today because very soon a special flight from Cuba will be arriving in the Oliver Tambo International Airport. On that flight, we'll be welcoming, and I have to be here, a group of students, South African students that concluded their 5th year of training as medical doctors in Cuba. They will be arriving in that flight. Also in that flight, I will be welcoming a Cuban brigade of water and sanitation engineers that will be deployed in South Africa to assist the South African government on that area after a new agreement we signed with the Department of Water and Sanitation. And finally, also in that flight, I will be welcoming today the Cuban Medical Brigade that is traveling to the Kingdom of Eswatini to assist that country in the efforts against COVID-19. The government of Eswatini has requested the medical brigade, and our government responded quickly, and they will be arriving to South Africa today. They will spend the night in South Africa, and they will be traveling tomorrow to the Kingdom of Eswatini. So for those reasons, Conrad, it's not possible for me to stay during the whole session, but a very good diplomat and good representative of Cuba, Conrad Dianelis, will be representing me until the end of the session. So with that, allow me to start with the presentation. Of course, it's very difficult to talk about the role of Cuba in Africa because we have to speak for many hours. So although I'm going to say some generalities, I will focus my presentation mainly on the role of Cuba in Southern Africa. And let's start with the historical context. Well, first of all, it's important to say that relations between Africa and Cuba are very deep-rooted and historic. As most of you know, 1.3 million of men, women, and children from Africa arrived in our island centuries ago as slaves. And their contribution was key in the formation of the Cuban nationality. Their influence, the African influence in Cuba is very strong and is very evident in our culture, including our music, our dance, our literature, even the influence, you can see the influence in the way we speak Spanish, in our food, in our religion. So Africa is part of the very essence of the Cuban nation. And Fidel Castro rightly said about that, Cuba is a Latin African people. So my first affirmation would be that you cannot understand the Cuban strong presence in Africa, in the continent, you cannot understand that in its true magnitude without full awareness of Africa's contribution to Cubanness. Also, another important element is that Africans played a key role in the Cubans' fight for independence against Spain, the colonial power. Let me tell you, of the 20,000 Cuban combatants for independence, 75% of them were Africans or African descendants. So that gives you an idea of how important was the role of Africans in the Cuban fight for independence. Let me say something very quickly about the Cuban role in Africa before the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. It's going to be very quick because, in summary, the role was null, completely null, because before 1959, the Cuban official policies despised Africa. Cuba was totally absent in the continent, no diplomatic relations with any country in the continent. And our only presence in Africa before 1959 was a very small and forgotten consulate in Egypt. So now let's say something about the position of Africa in the foreign policy of the Cuban Revolution. This means after 1959. First of all, immediately after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, we started to implement a lot of programs in many fields, including education, health, housing, employment, etc., that would benefit, first of all, the poor Cuban families. And among the poor families in Cuba, the Black population was overrepresented in relation to their demographic weight. So that means the policies of the Cuban Revolution were has as a priority the benefit for the Black population at that time. And those internal policies of the Cuban Revolution would have full correspondence with the new foreign policy of the revolution, which positioned international solidarity as a key element, the basis of the new foreign policy of the revolution. And that international solidarity included active support of the national liberation movements in Africa. That's why, since the 60s, immediately after the triumph of the revolution, you would see that Commander Fidel Castro, started to talk about a moral debt, a duty of compensation of Cubans with Africa because of the key role of Africans ancestors and their descendants in our independence wars and their key contribution to the formation of our nation, of the formation of the Cuban nation. So for the first time, you will see a country in Latin America saying that we have a moral debt and a duty of compensation with Africa. That's why Commander Fidel said at that time, very rightly, and I quote, "The fulfillment of solidarity obligations is not a virtue, it is a duty." So, in summary, international solidarity became the basis of the Cuban Revolution's foreign policy. And in that context, Africa became a priority for Cuba. But in addition to the moral and the ethical dimensions of international solidarity, I think we have to speak also about another component, another dimension of that international solidarity, which is our self-defense. And I'm going to quote Commander Fidel Castro because he explained that very clearly. I'm quoting him in this important paragraph. "The United States actually declared war against us." This is Fidel Castro. "It globalized the struggle against Cuba in order to suffocate the revolution. Therefore, we also globalized the revolutionary struggle against the United States. It was a question of globalizing our struggle in the face of the US global struggle against the Cuban Revolution. As to the assistance to the revolutionary movements, for us, it was not only our duty, but also a necessity." End of quote. So I think Fidel, with that, very clearly explained the component, the dimension of self-defense in our international solidarity. So when we started in practical terms to implement international solidarity and when we started to support African liberation movement, that was in 1961. It means only 2 years before, after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Our first assistance was to Algeria, to the Front of Liberación Nacional, FLN, the Algerian combatants against the French colonial occupation in that country. A Cuban ship, a ship named Bahía de Nipe, went to Algeria and transported weapons there. And that ship returning to Cuba with 78 wounded Algerian combatants and also 20 Algerian orphans that were later educated in Cuba. So that ship, our first action, solidarity action with an African liberation movement, symbolizes the two components of Cuban international solidarity. On one side you have the active military support for the independence movement, and on the other side you have civil assistance on health, education, etc. After Algeria in 1961, thousands of Cuban combatants and military instructors assisted liberation movement fighting against colonial occupation and independence in 17 African countries, including among them, as I said, Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Cape Verde, Equatorial Guinea, Congo, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Libya, Lesotho, Tanzania, Sao Tome and Principe. So as I said at the beginning, it's difficult to talk in detail about our practical assistance to all those 17 countries, but let me just say that 4,050, almost 500,000, 450,000 Cubans, almost 500,000 Cubans participated in a period of 30 years from 1961 until 1991, participated in the struggles for national independence or against foreign aggression in Africa. By the way, 2,289 of them lost their life combating in Africa. And you can see all those names in the wall of names in Freedom Park today. So now let's go to the main part of my presentation, which is the Cuban role in Southern Africa. Well, as you know, until 1974, the apartheid regime in South Africa was safe, was secure, because there was not a substantial resistance in Southern Africa against that regime. But then in 1975, the apartheid leaders saw the victory of the MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of Angola, in Angola, as a threat to their hegemony in the region and to their white supremacy system. That's the reason that on October 1975, the South African regime decided to invade Angola. The operation was called Operation Savannah. It was 4 battle groups, more than 5,000 troops invaded Angola in 1975. Let me show you. I have here a picture with me just to illustrate. I don't know if you can see. Those are some of the South African forces invading Angola on Operation Savannah in 1975. So, and then with that invasion came the first big defeat of the racist South Africa in Angola in 1975, 1976. So on 3rd of November 1975, the president of Angola at that time, Agostinho Neto, requests urgently support from Cuba to stop the apartheid's army's invasion. And the Cuban government responded in 48 hours, just 2 days. On 5th of November, Just 2 days after the request from the president of Angola, a, the first Cuban team, a team of 158 elite Cuban commandos, boarded in secret 2 planes in Havana and took off for Angola. That was 5th November 1975, the beginning of Operation Carlota, that was in place for 15 years. Operation Carlota, the name of Carlota, was a tribute to an African slave, that a slave woman that led two slave uprisings in Cuba, in the province of Matanzas, in 1843, and she died fighting for her freedom. This is very impressive. Let me read to you one paragraph of the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro instructions to that first commando. He was saying goodbye to them in the airport, 5th November 1975, 3 a.m. Those people were traveling to Angola without knowing in detail the situation there, and Fidel explained to them, let me quote, "The situation in Angola is different. You must stop the South Africans before they reach Luanda, capital of Angola. Many of you will not return. Listen to this. Many of you will not return. Fight with the MPLA. If the MPLA lost the capital, go to the hills and continue fighting. If the MPLA gave up, only then, if possible, the survivors among you should fall back to our embassy in San." Those were the instructions given by Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro to that first group of Cuban combatants. But immediately after that first group, thousands of Cuban military personnel crossed the Atlantic. We are talking about more than 1,200 kilometers, almost 8,000 miles. They crossed the Atlantic by air and by sea with tanks, aircraft, and other weapons. So by the end of December 1975, that means less than 2 months after the request of assistance, by end of December, Cuba had in Angola already 25 Southern combatants, 25 Southern troops. And by the beginning of 1976, we already have in that country 36 Southern combatants. And how we did it? Let me show you. We only had at that time 2 cargo ships and 3 very old Britannia 318 aircraft that have been already discontinued by the British manufacturers. Only 3 aircraft like this. Let me show you. On those aircraft like this, 3 of these, we moved 36 Southern troops to Angola in 2 months. Now, with that strong presence, of course, with the Cuban military force deployed in Angola, that completely transformed the balance of powers on the ground. So the apartheid troops were stopped and they were forced to retreat. Angola was able to preserve its independence. But for the next 10 years, that means from 1977 until 1987, Pretoria continued sporadic military operations in Angola, because Angola, on those years, became the strategic area in South Africa's drive for regional hegemony. Now let's enter to an important element, which is the Cuito-Cuanavale battle. The battle that, in the opinion of many, redefined Southern Africa. It was not a short battle. The Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale took place for 6 months, from October 1987 until March 1988. It's known by many as the Africans Stalingrad, and it is the largest military battle in Africa since World War II. At that time, South Africa decided to invade Angola in full force on October 1987. And as a result of the invasion, the FAPLA, the Angolan army, suffered heavy losses. And those FAPLA combatants retreat to a small town in the south of Angola named Quito Cuanavale. So determined to impose a fatal blow against independent Angola, Pretoria committed its best troops and most sophisticated military equipment to the capture of Quito Cuanavale. So the South African Defense Force, the racist army, deployed 10,000 troops, 10,000 soldiers at Quito, plus several thousand of UNITA troops. Angolan armed forces were placed in an extremely precarious situation. And remember that at that time, the racist army and the UNITA troops were heavily supported by the US government. Let me show you a photo of some of the South African troops. You will see here preparing to attack the town of Quito, Cuanavale, in 1987. The government of Angola, on that difficult situation, requested for the second time the urgent support of Cuba. And Cuba once again responded. The apartheid victory, that was our thinking, apartheid victory would have meant not only the capture of Quito Cuanavale and the destruction of the best military Angola troops, but quite possible a victory of South Africa on Quito would have meant the end of Angola's independence and the strengthening of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So Fidel, Commander Fidel, and the Cuban government decided to go further than just the defense of Quito Cuanavale. The strategy, the Cuban strategy, was to deploy the necessary new Cuban forces in Angola. We already have in Angola at that time 35,000 people. But the strategy was to deploy additional forces and to launch an offensive, a big offensive, that would both put an end once and for all to South African aggressions against Angola and deliver a decisive blow against the apartheid regime in South Africa. So very quickly, 20,000 additional Cuban troops. We already have 35,000 in Angola. So 20,000 more for a total of 55,000 Cuban combatants went to Angola immediately. For a small country like it is Cuba, with only 10 million of people at that time, today we have a little more than 11 million. But with 10 million people at that time, it could be the equivalent of the US deploying more than 1 million soldiers outside their country. Not only we sent to that battle 55,000 people, we sent 1,200 tanks, an artillery battalion, more than 1,000 anti-aircraft weapons, more than 150 MiG-23 combat aircraft, and many helicopters, which means that the scale of the military operation deployed by Cuba was enormous, was huge. Let me show you just a picture of some of the Cuban combatants in Quito, Cuanavale. Fidel Castro explained later the position, what was the consequence of the decision we took to deploy such a strong military force in Angola at that time. And Fidel said about that, I'm quoting here, the Cuban Revolution had put its own existence at stake against an apartheid regime armed to the teeth. At such a great distance from our small country and with our own resources, our own arms, we even ran the risk of weakening our own defenses, and we did so. We used our chips and ours alone, and we used our equipment to change the correlation of forces, which made success possible in that battle. We put everything at the stake on that action. So that is very illustrative of the huge risk that the Cuban Revolution assumed in implementing his international solidarity policy. Now, during the 6 months of the Battle of Quito Cuanavale, the South African racist troops threw everything to us, with the support, of course, with several Southern of UNITA troops. They use modern tanks, they use armored cars, massive 155 millimeters G5 cannons. By the way, those cannons continue in the armed forces of South Africa. They are very sophisticated. So they threw everything in Quito. This is just part of the troops of South Africa moving into Quito to attack the Cuban troops there. They carry out in 1988, the South African racist regime, 3 major assaults to Quito, but every time they were rejected and suffered heavy losses, and the final defeat came on 23rd of March of 1988. The South African Defense Forces troops have to withdraw from Quito, and then Cuba started the second part of the strategy, which was to move towards Namibia. Here you have a picture of, this picture was very famous at that time. You will see there, after the defeat of the apartheid regime in Quito Cuanavale, you see some of Cuban soldiers in a South African tank. This photo was heavily circulated at that time in 1988. So Pretoria had become so focused on attacking Quito that they have left themselves exposed to a major military counterattack. And then on April 1988, Cuba launched a breathtaking offensive. 40,000 Cuban troops, joined by 30,000 Angolan troops, 3,000 SWAPO guerrillas, and also combatants from the MK from South Africa. All of those forces moved toward the Namibian border. So the South African regime cannot resist that offensive. They have to withdraw from South Africa to South Africa. The war was effectively over. The last South African soldier left Angola on August 30, 1988. So that means that as a result of that strategy, the regional balance of power in Southern Africa had been fundamentally transformed. Now, what was the situation of South Africa after Quito Cuanavale? Well, as you know, the South African regime for the first time was obliged to sit on the table of negotiations seriously, together with Cuba, Angola, and the US, the quadripartite negotiation. On February 1990, Nelson Mandela was released, and the ANC and the South African Communist Party were legalized. The apartheid regime was forced to recognize the independence of Namibia in March 1990. After our duty has been accomplished, the Cuban troops withdraw from Angola on 25th of May 1991. So that was the successful conclusion of Operation Carlota after 15 years of combat in Angola. I think Nelson Mandela described it very well, the consequence of the Battle of Quito Cuanavale, when Mandela said, I'm quoting Mandela here, without the defeat of Quito Cuanavale, our organizations would not have been unbound. The defeat of the racist army at Quito Cuanavale has made it possible for me to be here today. Quito Cuanavale was a milestone in the history of the struggle for Southern African liberation. By the way, it's important to say that 2 years ago, the head of states of the Southern Africa Development Community, the SADC head of states, decided to permanently designate 23rd of March as the Southern Africa Liberation Day in honor to the Quito Cuanavale battle. And I think that's a great homage to those combatants that lost their life on that important battle. So, something about the Cuban assistance to the anti-apartheid forces at that time. Well, in addition to what I said already, as you know, most of the Cuban papers on that period is still classified. I think someday the whole history, all details will be known. But for the time being, we can say, because it's already known, that Cuba trained in secret hundreds of cadres from the ANC, from the South African Communist Party, and from the MK in Angola and in Cuba. The specialized training included organization of underground cells, smuggling of weapons, shooting, forging documents, etc. It is also known that Cuba provided to the MK a lot of equipment and armaments. And many South African anti-apartheid fighters carry out with them Cuban passports to facilitate their international travel. Here you have a picture. I think this picture was taken in one of the training camps in Cuba. You see there are some Cuban and South African anti-apartheid fighters during a practice session at the training camp. Now, let me say something about the civil cooperation and the continuity of civil cooperation of Cuba with Africa. Sorry about this. Cuba, first of all, is the country of the world with the highest percentage of nationals serving in international civil missions, voluntarily civil missions on the world. Right now, just to give you some numbers, 47,000 Cuban international corporations workers are present today in 61 nations. 30,000 of them are medical doctors. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have now more than 4,000 Cuban cooperators. Exactly, we have 4,457. They are working in 28 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Most of them are health professionals. On the issue of training of the training of the youth in Africa, so far over 50,000 students from Africa have graduated in Cuban universities on different specialties. And right now, we have more than 8,000. The number is 8,533 African students that are being trained today in Cuba in various universities. Most of them under free scholarships granted by our government. And I told you at the beginning, just in a few minutes, an airplane coming from Cuba will be arriving with some South African students that have been training as medical doctors in Cuba. And let's talk about a little bit more about South Africa. As of 2019, as of last year, almost 2,000 South Africans trained in Cuba under the Nelson Mandela Fidel Castro Health Cooperation Program have graduated as doctors. But then this year, very soon, on December 2020, more than 700 new South African doctors trained in Cuba for 5 years will graduate. So this year in South Africa, as a result of the Mandela Fidel's program, you will have the biggest graduation in the history of doctors in the history of South Africa because of those 700 doctors that were trained in Cuba for 5 years. But the numbers are also very impressive for the next 2 years. On 2021, 627 additional doctors trained in Cuba will graduate, South African students trained in Cuba. and in 2022, 616. This means that in only 3 years, 2020, 21, and 22, South Africa will have almost 2,000 additional doctors formed and trained in Cuba. What a beautiful results, what a beautiful monument to those two leaders to have such great numbers of new doctors coming to South Africa after 5 years of training in Cuba. So just concluding, let me say, one of the peculiarities of the Cuban policy, Cuban revolution policy towards Africa is the high level of support, internal support of that policy in Cuba. What is the reason of that high level of support? Well, there's several reasons. One of them is that our society is highly familiarized with Africa. This is not very common in other countries in our region, but in Cuba, take into account that almost 1 million of Cubans have lived in Africa for extended periods of time in civilian or military missions. That's a very, not only unprecedented number, but a very impressive number if you take into account that Cuba is a non-African country with only 11 millions of inhabitants. So 1 million of our people have been living for some time in Africa. Another reason of that, the high level of support in Cuba to our policy towards Africa is that Africa occupies an important place in the Cuban press, in the radio, in the TV, and the printed press. So people knows a lot about Africa. Africa is an independent discipline in Cuban university, and many Cuban institutions are involved in the study of the African continent. So my conclusions would be three conclusions. One, geographical distance separate Africa and Cuba, but deep and indestructible ties unite us. Second, Africa has been and will continue to be a high priority of the Cuban foreign policy. My conclusion is that, as a well-known African proverb, African says goes, the footprints of the people that walk together can never be erased. So with that, comrades, I'm really sorry for being so long. I conclude my presentation.
Compañero Ambassador, gracias por su excelente aporte. You are most welcome. We really appreciate your input. As I said to Comrade Daniel, my Spanish has dried up. I've not been to Cuba for some time now. Firstly, your apology is highly acceptable, given the important assignment as you continue, but to deliver on your promises and the promises, commitment made by our forebears, being Madiba and Commander Fidel Castro. Your country's selflessness can be measured that Cuba has no colony. Those who pretend to be helping others for their self-interest, they colonize their country. As we speak, Angola, which we have contributed in defending its freedom, uses Portuguese. They are still use the colony's language, so to speak, like South Africa. I don't know how much time you have, Ambassador, so that we can release you at an appropriate time. But I want, if possible, before you leave, just to allow one or two comrades to comment, so that, but depending on the time you have for us.
Okay, comrade, thank you very much for your words. I think I will have like 2 minutes before leaving, so maybe I can, maybe one comrade can make a comment if they wish to do so.
Okay, is there any comrade who want to comment? Just one. Comrade Reneva, if there are no volunteers, I will dictate.
Comrade Franz, Comrade
Hello.
Rafika, Comrade Rafika has indicated she wants to comment.
Okay, Comrade Rafika, thanks, Comrade Jenny.
No, thanks, Comrade Franz. Comrade Rodolfo, your input was most extensive. I won't really go on about the content of it, but I just want to emphasize a point, comrades, that, you know, as we recollect and try to gain deeper understandings about the significance of the Cuban intervention in Africa, that led to our own liberation, and as Ambassador has clearly stated that within the next 3 years, we are still going to be expecting an additional 2,000 doctors. So we would have had 4,000 within this period of time. But to make a point that we must not forget that Cuba's military successes against the South African Boers in Angola is what forced South Africans to get to the negotiating table in 1987. And whilst the negotiations through the United Nations started in 1987, it was only in 1988 did the Battle of Cuito Cuanavalle happen. That was long after negotiations had begun. And yet, up until today, the Boers deny defeat. And I think that is a fundamental issue that we must be very cognizant about, because it speaks to the cowardness traits of the Boers that they still hold on to. I just want to share with comrades before Ambassador leaves, an experience.
Comrade Speaker, don't exhaust the limited time, because there's one comrade also I wanted to give before the ambassador. Ambassador said there's 2 minutes before he leaves. So if you can just be sparing for others as well. We can continue discussing after the ambassador has left. Are you fine with that?
No, that's fine, comrade.
Okay. Comrade Andile.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to ask a quick question to the ambassador as to whether don't they consider to transform the enrollment of medicine so that they can also accommodate languages such as English, so that it can be much more easier for as many young people as possible to enroll? I just wanted to ask that question.
Thank you. Let's ask the ambassador maybe to respond to the question, and if he wants to comment on what Lifika said, but we will discuss the rest of the input after he has left, after Comrade Chris has spoken. Ambassador?
Yeah, comrade, I'm not sure I get the question rightly. The question was if we can incorporate English lessons on those trained in Cuba as medical doctors. Can you please clarify the question?
Yes, yes, Ambassador. In fact, not only limited to medicine, but even to other qualifications that we are getting there. Is it not possible that you must try to also accommodate English in those courses so that it can be much more easier?
Well, I'm not sure I get the question correctly, but I'm trying to answer.
Ambassador, what it means, the medium of instruction for teaching a course, can it be open up, not be Spanish only, but also in English, and not only medicine, but all other courses people might be interested in?
Well, that's something that for sure we can consider, but let me tell you something. One of the additional results, the obvious result of the Mandela's Fidel program is that you have doctors that are trained in Cuba on a different perspective of health, which means the preventive health. Because, you know, in South Africa, the basic approach to medicine is the curative medicine, which is very expensive because that means you put most of the efforts, most of the money, most of the budget in hospitals to cure people that get sick. In Cuba, it's different. In Cuba, the approach is to prevent people to become sick in the first place. That's why we have so many community doctors. We have, you know, Cuba is the country with the highest per capita of doctors in the world because we have in every block, in every community, every 100 meters, we have a doctor and a nurse. And those are checking every day their population, giving them advice, treating them to avoid that those persons get sick and have to go to the hospital. Because when you work in the community, you will solve 75% of the health problems can be solved on a preventive approach. So that is something that those doctors, when they come back, they also try to implement in South Africa. But a second important result of that program is that you also have a lot of young people speaking a second language, which is Spanish. You know, Spanish is, after Chinese, the second more spoken language in the world. So when you have those 4,000 young students coming back, because you know the first year in Cuba is to learn Spanish. We can do it in English, but in my opinion, it's an added value that those young professionals are coming not only dominating the preventive approach to medicine, but only dominating an important language of the world, which is important in many ways, including because South Africa is in much better position than other countries to have closest relation with Latin America. You know, in Latin America, we have 34 countries. 29 of them speak Spanish. We are talking about millions of people. So those young professionals in the future would be also an important factor in strengthening the bilateral relations between South Africa and Cuba. So in summary, I'm saying that to incorporate English on the lessons would be an option that we can consider. But do not lose this an important added value of learning Spanish and practicing Spanish 5 years in Cuba. My own experience, whenever I go around South Africa, even in those very remote towns, villages, you will always see one person that will speak to you in Spanish, and they will proudly say to me, I was trained in Cuba. Cuba is my second home, and I'm here to try to practice Spanish because I learned that. I'm so happy whenever I see a young South African in remote village calling me and saying, Ambassador, don't speak to me in English. I can do it in Spanish. So that would be my recommendation, not to lose sight on the importance of bringing to South Africa so many people speaking Spanish very well. I don't know if I responded to the question.
Ambassador, thank you very much. You stand released. Go and pursue this important mission of receiving our comrades. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your time.
Thank you, Conrad, and thank you to all the Conrads participating in the seminar. As I said before, the Cuban position will continue to be present in the seminar because my Conrad, the analyst, will be following the whole discussion. And if you have any additional questions or any comments, you can address those comments and questions to her. Thank you very much, Conrad.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you. Amanda.
Mandla.
Away too.
Anta.
Arona. You know, this was very, very good input. Comrade Chris, at one stage when we were reviewing the Quito Carnival, what do you call video, which we found in the UK. It was so emotional, moving, exciting at the same time to see body bags of the apartheid soldiers hidden back into the country because they didn't want to be seen that they have been defeated. Let's hand over to you, Comrade Chris. I know Comrade are very thirsty to engage in the discussion. Sorry, Comrade Lifika, I'll let to cut you, but you'll come back after Comrade Chris. Over to you, Comrade Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Comrade Franz, and also I'm just acknowledge the presentation that's made by the Ambassador, Comrade Rodolfo. I think what we think we should be doing is to build on the presentation that was made by Comrade Ambassador. For obvious reasons, ours is not something that goes in another direction. But also in building up, to look at what I think are important considerations in the ideological and political framework, if you like, the ideological and political framework that shaped Cuba's internationalist foreign policy to Africa, and also built on it and developed it even further to what it is today. So if you allow, our view, and these are just points that we think we must flag for an even greater, deeper discussion and engagement, that the post-1959 Fidel Castro revolution in Cuba was ushered into a terrain of a tumultuous world event. What do we mean by that? Is that the revolutionary Cuba came into a world that was characterized by the Cold War, meaning on one side, the aggressive imperialist onslaught of the United States and the West was at its sharpest. And on the other side was the Soviet Union, a strong Soviet Union acting as a bulwark against US-led foreign Western imperialism, domination, and etc. But also post-1959, Castro's revolutionary Cuba was ushered in particular in Africa, in a decolonizing Africa, which had started to decolonize in the late 1950s, 1958, 1959. The process of decolonization on the African continent was taking shape, and African states were beginning to, were in the formative years at that part. But also that there were still struggles for national liberation being waged on the continent. Importantly is that Cuba came into the picture also at the time of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War that started in 1955 and ended in April 1975 also had an impact and or characterized the relationship of how others perceived and or understood America's militarism and its deployment of forces outside of the US. So America's defeat in Vietnam itself played some role in the formation and or in articulation of what Cuba would understand to be the elements and or dimensions of its foreign policy, internationalist foreign policy to Africa. These things were also taking part in the background of the 1955 Bandung Conference, which ushered in the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement that characterized itself as, well as the name says, non-aligned, either to the East or the West. But importantly, what the non-alignment movement underpinned as its principles was that it was a large-scale Asian-African or an Afro-Asian conference of newly independent states that articulated, among other things, peace and the role of the Third World War, the Third World in the Cold War, economic development, and decolonization. In fact, their key pillar of the Bandung Conference was to support national liberation and the realization of sovereignty of nations, in particular, in the African continent, in the Third World, in Asia, and in Latin America. We can also not forget the fact that by 1966, just a few years after 1959, Cuba hosted the Tricontinental Conference in Havana. And at that conference, it gathered the largest come together of national liberation movements, and the majority of them developed a particular relationship and affinity towards the Cuban Revolution, its outlook, and what it propounded. Fidel's Revolutionary Cuba, comrades, and the July 26th revolutionary movement was an exemplar for many national liberation movements on the African continent. They appreciated its tactics, they appreciated its strategies on people's war and etc. But importantly, they also embraced the iconic leadership of the July 26th movement. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, at the time, even Camilo Cienfuegos and others. And these, we want to argue, comrades, built on the historic ties that Africa had forged with Cuba, as the ambassador was actually articulating, of the impact of slavery on the nationhood of Cuba and the large number of Afro-Cubanos that existed in that area, including others who fought in the independence wars pre-1959, and who were upheld and recognized in the post-1959 period. Maximo Gomez and others who were important independence fighters for Cuba. It was an important element that shaped and brought together organically the relationship between Cuba and Africa. We want to argue again, comrades, that Cuba's first venture on the African continent played an important part, not only for Cuba, but also for Africa itself. When Cuba went to Algeria to go and assist the Algerian National Liberation Forces against French colonialism at the time, Cuban fighters and leaders had great admiration for the Algerian Revolution. The Algerian Revolution was also one of the most bloodiest national liberation struggles that were fought on the continent. But the Algerians also, on one hand, had a symbiotic admiration of the Cuban revolutionary struggles. It was like the Cuban fighters saying the Algerian revolution and fighters remind them of their own struggle in the Sierra Maestras and etc. And the Algerian national liberation movement appreciated, as I said, the tactics, the strategies, and etc. And that symbiotic commonalities that existed between the struggles of the two peoples of Algeria and Cuba created a deep relationship between Algeria and Cuba. And before his assassination, Ben Bella was one of the greatest leader on the African continent to actually exalt the Cuban example in many ways. Cuba's decisive aid to the Algerian revolutionary effort, both during and after the successful War of National Independence in the early 60s, resonated with Cuba and Algeria's understanding of what we call a multifaceted and a multi-layered relationship. So before winning the national liberation struggle in Algeria, the Cubans played an important part in the military aspect of that struggle, supplying technical advisors and other things. But also, after winning the revolution in Algeria, Cuba translated that aid into a different form of support for Algeria. It began to develop this notion of sending aid, doctors, nurses, and other important capacities and skills that would enable a war-ravaged Algeria to recoup infrastructure, personnel, and other things, including teaching Cuban youth and others, training them in different disciplines and aspects in Cuba itself. And that understanding of this multifaceted, multi-layered relationship, we want to argue, played an important part in adding a dimension to what we call Cuba's internationalist foreign policy to Africa. And that's why, among other things, I think the ambassador's acceptable non-presence here of going to receive students that studied in Cuba, but also receive a group of Cuban medical professionals going to serve another nation, is part of this multifaceted, multi-layered relationship between Cuba and the continent itself, which we want to argue started with the experience and the lessons learned in the Algerian Revolution. You will also remember that the ANC, in fact, the first commanders of African National Congress, Comrade Nelson Mandela, also had military training in Algeria. So there was this appreciation of the Algerian Revolution, its strategies and tactics, which shared a symbiotic relationship with Cuba and Cuba's revolutionary process, the People's War, and lessons been learned by South Africa, which at the point, 1960-61, was also seeking to engage in military struggles. The successful Algerian Revolution, we think, also forged in this notion of third worldism. Third worldism. What do we mean by that? By that, we actually mean that the peoples of the third world who were waging revolutionary struggles gained confidence that their struggles, well, put differently, that David could beat Goliath. The fact that 1959 happened in Cuba, and also that the Algerian Revolution was able to defeat the mighty French with the assistance of Cuba, there was hope for the national liberation movement on the African continent. And that aspect found itself in the confidence of the third world and third worldism, as we say. Cuba's relationship with the African continent, as Ambassador was articulating, also stems from slavery, the fact that hundreds of African slaves were sent on to the so-called New World, and including in Cuba, where the Havana port played an important part in the distribution of the African slaves to the other Latin American countries, placed Cuba and Havana as an important port, as an important area of connect between Latin America and African continent. If we move on and look at Cuba and Central Africa, I mean, comrades will remember that Chair also came to Congo in the immediate aftermath of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution around the 60s, and etc. Though I think the point to make about Cuba in Central Africa, and in particular in the Congo, had to do with upsetting the balance of geopolitical power in the area. Congo, it must be remembered, has huge reserves and continues to have huge reserves of cobalt and uranium. And these two minerals are important in many ways. One, cobalt is important in the technological advancements that have been made and were being discovered at the time. Uranium was an important element in nuclear power. And in the context of the Cold War, the US and the West did not anticipate and or foresee another nuclear power emerging and or supporting the Soviet Union in expanding its nuclear technology by getting access to the minerals that are in the Congo. And that, among other things, also spurred on Congo's newly acquired independence in days, led by Patrice Lumumba, who was overthrown successfully with assistance, the direct intervention of the CIA, which killed Patrice Lumumba, in order to shift the balance of power away from the Soviet Union and away from any other nation that aspired for nuclear ambitions. Because of the existence of these two minerals that existed in the Congo. I mean, though Chair's short-lived Cuban experience did not bear sufficient fruit, it was important in a way in that Chair was able to, also in Tanzania when he went undercover to the Congo, he met Southern Africa's National Liberation Movement leaders in Tanzania and had a discussion with them, and the Southern African National Liberation Movements represented by SWAPO, the African National Congress, Frelimo, and ZAPU, had an audience with Chair, and we could understand the importance of that discussion in the context of them forging a national liberation movement. The other area in which I think Cuba learned very important lessons, and Africa also got to interact with Cuba more deeply, was in Guinea-Bissau. And if you study the leader of the struggles of Guinea-Bissau deeply, Comrade Amilcar Cabral, you will understand that though Comrade Amilcar Cabral said that their project was neither Soviet nor Cuban, and that it was a socialism for the conditions of Guinea-Bissau, he learned important lessons in the theater of military struggle from the Cuban Revolution, but also developed a perspective that was important to support the struggle for national liberation in Guinea-Bissau. One of the strategies that Amilcar Cabral applied in the conditions of Guinea-Bissau was that theirs was a long, protracted struggle, that what they needed to do was to wear the enemy down. And remember, the enemy in Guinea-Bissau was the Portuguese colonizer of dictator Caetano. However, when Caetano leased a piece of land, a piece of island on the Azores, just across the Indian Ocean, very close to the west coast of Africa there, leased that piece of island to the Americans, and they created an airfield where America's military airplanes could land, and et cetera, that immediately sent an important message to Cabral. And he sought the assistance of Cuba, but under the auspices that Cuba was only going to train its forces, that what they intended to do was to wear down the enemy. And indeed, they did that by wearing down the Portuguese fighters, who subsequently led an officers' rebellion in Cuba, in Portugal, and that led to the overthrow of Caetano and led to the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. And that was important. But also that Guinea-Bissau provided an important basis for Cuba to expand its foreign policy, internationalist foreign policy contacts. It is in that region that various Cuban leaders actually went in Benin. And we also know that Che Guevara also toured that area, including Egypt, talking about the Cuban Revolution, talking about the important aspects of a non-aligned perspective, which gelled very well with the aspirations of national liberation on the African continent. In West Africa, Fidel also met Sekou of Guinea and met important leaders in West Africa. And the platform which was created, as I said, the Tricontinental Conference that was held in Havana was an important platform for forging this coordination and forging this getting together of national liberation movements, their perspectives, their ideas, and a bloc in defense of national liberation movements that are articulating a different path of and or trajectory of development for their societies. The Cuban ambassador also talked, well, Comrade Rudolph also talked about Cuba and Angola. And I will not delve into, because I think he covered a lot of ground in that presentation he made on Quito Carnival, and more broadly, just in Angola. Suffice to say that when the request for aid came, Fidel, among other things, also said, and I quote, "The history of Africa will be written as before and after Quito Carnival," close quote. And indeed, the history of Africa was rewritten in most significant ways, even though some elements in the right-wing conservative circuits are continuing to want to reproduce a narrative that apartheid South African regime was not defeated in Quito Carnival. But all the data, all the facts indicate a defeat of the apartheid regime in Quito Carnival. You can only look up to how the anti-conscription campaign also took hold in South Africa in a big way between and amongst white young university students, whether it was in Cape Town, whether it was in Rhodes and elsewhere. That anti-conscription campaign gained huge resonance with young whites precisely because they were seeing from time to time huge numbers of body bags coming back from that conscripted war that was happening across the border in Angola. And that demoralized many young, innocent white South Africans at the time who were thrown into a war that they did not understand and or support. But because there was conscription to the army at the time, it forced 18-year-olds to 23-year-olds to be part of the apartheid South African Defense Force. And any indication that seeks to suggest a different narrative is actually a falsification and or undermining of the facts and the data that exist on the ground in respect of South Africa's defeat in Quito Carnival. It was also the Cubans, we want to argue, who insisted that in the post-Quito Carnival negotiations, that direct talks between Cuba, the US, and the other two countries involved, Angola and South Africa, should happen. You will remember that the US, since 1959, in fact, since Cuba nationalized commanding heights of industry, including American firms and others in Cuba, America applied a unilateral illegal blockade against Cuba and actually abhorred and stopped any direct interactions and or engagement between the US and Cuba. But for the first time, and upon Cuba's insistence, that direct talks in respect of a post-Quito Carnivale negotiations of what should happen in that region, in Southern Africa in particular, that there should be direct talks between the US, Cuba, Angola, and South Africa. And those talks chaired by Chester Crocker happened. And the legendary Jorge Risquet led the Cuban negotiations at that part. And he makes a very good, very jolly point that one of the things that he agitated the South Africans about was to insist on lighting his Cuban cigar during meetings. And this is before no smoking in conference halls and etc. But Jorge Risquet, as part of the tactics of engaging the TF Malan and Pet Water, he used to light a Cuban cigar in the conference hall and in the conference meeting and just puff on the Cuban cigar, and then the Cuban aroma will just envelope all of the conference hall. And they will become a bit dizzy. I'm not sure about becoming dizzy, but that's why I think some of us do Cuban cigars. There's just a small advert for the Cuban cigar. But also, comrades, I think we need to understand the implications and the consequences for apartheid militarism in Southern Africa in a post-Quito Carnivale era. Whereas apartheid was in a position to destabilize much of Southern Africa, either directly through what they called missions of assassinations, where they even went to assassinate ANC members, Matola, Lesotho, Botswana, even in Zimbabwe, Jokabi assassinated in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. That possibility did not exist anymore post-Quito Carnivale. Post-Quito Carnivale, the apartheid regime did not have the audacity of pursuing militarily targets in Southern Africa, if you like, in the frontline states. And also that the apartheid regime had to deal with its proxies in Southern Africa. It had to deal with its support to UNITA. That support to UNITA, which was also very significant in that it was sending money and arms to UNITA together with the CIA and the United States. Post-Quito Carnivale, they were unable to do that because UNITA, which was stationed also in the South, was disrupted from operating in the South as a result of Quito Carnivale itself. You must also remember that UNITA and the apartheid regime in conducting insurgencies into foreign territories committed atrocious murderous acts of killing women and children in Kasinga, in what is now referred as a Kasinga murder, where it said it was pursuing SWAPO fighters in the region. And whereas Kasinga was actually a designated area for exiles registered under the United Nations, the apartheid regime undermined all of those things and committed the murder of hundreds of women and children in the Kasinga murders. His other proxy was Dhlakama's Renamo in Mozambique. It used Dhlakama's Renamo in Mozambique to also destabilize Zapu and Frelimo in the northeastern parts of Mozambique, so that Frelimo did not have the operational space in much of northern Mozambique. And as you would know, that much of southern Mozambique was occupied by Portuguese, together with some elements of Black Mozambicans recruited by the security forces, the Portuguese security forces in Mozambique. But after the fall of the Carnation War, the apartheid regime continued to clandestinely support Dhlakama to perpetuate a tribal and a regional war in Mozambique, which has had great consequences for both infrastructure and the cohesion of Mozambique itself. In Zimbabwe, the apartheid regime supported the Salo Scouts. The Salo Scouts were the clandestine armed force, armed wing in Zimbabwe, very racist, which was used to pursue national liberation fighters in Zimbabwe itself. So the post-Cuba Carnevale defeat of the apartheid regime in some ways weakened this extensive support of proxies, direct incursions, and other missionary missions that the apartheid regime used to undertake in Southern Africa. And as Ambassador indicated, comrades, we will not deeply understand, at least up until now, the support that Cuba has undertaken, precisely because much of the Cuban classified documents remain classified. For example, Cuba and the Communist Party of Cuba hosted the 7th Congress of the South African Communist Party in exile, and the last conference to be held in exile in Cuba. And that conference had huge logistics because it was drawing both the underground in South Africa and the exiled leadership of the party in various parts of the world. Cuba provided logistics and other things to bring all of the delegates who were meant to attend the 7th Congress in Cuba. It brought them into Cuba quietly, and there was no knowledge, both in the CIA, the FBI, the MI16, and in South Africa's intelligence circles that could sniff out that a 7th Congress of the South African Communist Party was taking place in Cuba. And that speaks to the capacities, the capabilities that Cuba possessed to pull together such an intricate and such a difficult task of bringing together almost 100 or so people into the 7th Congress of the party in exile itself. That Cuba started in the formative years of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s to accept and train in various disciplines, militarily, educationally, and otherwise, many people from the African continent and elsewhere in Cuba. In only a year and a half or so of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was already accepted. And given the precarity of the Cuban Revolution at the time, it was, at least for some of us, a risky, with hindsight, it should have been a risky undertaking to have been undertaken by the Cuban leadership at the time. But so confident was the Cuban Revolution and its leadership that it understood that that dimension of internationalist foreign policy was an important contribution to humanity itself and shaped the later dimensions of what I call the multifaceted, multi-layered internationalist outlook of Cuba, well, both for Africa and the Third World, that Havana, we can argue, understands and understood then the importance of humanity and humanism. Cuba has aided progressive regimes and revolutionary movements on the African continent, as we argue, since 1961, and have made their contributions and continue to make their contributions in a post, if you like, military epoch of engagement, where national liberation movements are now in power. Cuba has not deserted those national liberation movements that are now in power and continues to play a role, as the ambassador was giving us the data of the Cuban medical professionals across the world, almost 50,000 of them, and almost 1 million of the 11 million Cuban inhabitants have served foreign missions, is an indication of a contribution very significant for a people who have the least of resources to sustain them, themselves in Cuba, but are willing and able to share, not what they don't have, but what they have, nominal, minimal as it is, with humanity at a great risk in the context of the existing illegal and unilateral blockade that continues to characterize relations between Cuba and the United States. And that's why we come to the conclusion, Comrade Chair, that Cuba was destined for Africa and Africa was destined for Cuba. Venceremos. Thank you very much.
Are you done, Comrade Chris?
Hello.
Comrade Chris, are you done?
Comrade Franz, I'm done.
Oh, you didn't indicate full stop, so no. Let's invite comments, questions, and thanks, Comrade Chris, for the on point input. And I think it builds on what the ambassador has presented. Let's invite now comments. Maybe let me start with Comrade Lifika. Comrade Lifika, if he's still there, because
Comrade Chair, maybe before you start, you will have to check your time and make a decision, I think, from your side on how long do you want us to go. We had planned to finish at 18 hours. Now, when we come to this space, I think from your side, you will have to decide how long you want to open this. Yeah, I think I just wanted to raise this.
Okay. Comrades, let's agree on the time. Comrade Mushekwa, didn't we budget 4 to 6?
Yes, we budgeted that, and I can see that we are left now with 18 minutes.
Okay, let's see if maybe we can't push it to 6:15 if comrades are flexible. Alternatively, 6:30, that's the stretch we can go.
Okay.
Definitely 6:30 will have to end.
Okay.
Okay, Jenny, I didn't check the hands.
At this stage, Comrade Chris, there are no hands yet.
Comrade Lifika, are you still there? I did promise you will come back.
Comrade Reniva is indicating as well, and Comrade Mbizo.
Okay, let's take Comrade Reniva.
Thank you, Comrade Franz, and thank you to the second DGS for his very insightful analysis. Both the inputs of the ambassador and of the second DGS was very one-sided in the sense that we have a very good idea of Cuba's contribution in Africa as a whole and to South Africa specifically. But the sense that we don't get is to what extent did we, once we had attained our liberation, given the significant benefit that we had from Cuba's intervention and support, how did we reciprocate? So some insight in that regard will be useful, and also as to whether our reciprocation has been sufficient. Have we expressed sufficient international solidarity, and particularly have we expressed sufficient solidarity with Cuba? Comrade Chris also alluded to the role of Algeria and the relationship between Algeria and Cuba, the relationship between Guinea-Bissau and Cuba. And if we reflect on South Africa, and especially the South African Communist Party's relationships with Polisario and oh my gosh.
ICC.
ICC. Yes. So just recently, in fact, there was I shouldn't say recently, in December, there was an election in Guinea-Bissau. And once again, they were denied the opportunity to govern because the presidential election was rigged. At no point did South Africa intervene. We see the struggles of Western Sahara. We're leaving Algeria all to its own to try and manage Morocco? To what extent is South Africa, other than our press statements and the occasional visit, to what extent are we substantively demonstrating our solidarity? And then also, the ambassador of Cuba gave some indication of how the adverse effects, the risks, I shouldn't say the adverse effects, the risks that they took in order to deploy so many resources to the Battle of Cuitacuanaval. What we haven't looked at is, in addition, what are the current challenges that Cuba is experiencing? What are the sacrifices? I mean, what is the price? What is the price that they are paying for having so assertively advanced an alternative trajectory and supported marginalized and oppressed countries and people in this world? And then within that context, knowing that the sanctions are still there, knowing that they are constantly being destabilized by the USA, is South Africa doing enough, given the role that we played in the UN Security Council and given the role that we play on the continent? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Reniva. Comrade Mbizo.
No, thank you very much, Chair. Comrade Chris, actually, it's Comrade thank you here. The question, the question will be far better if it was directed to the ambassador, but generally you can also assist. I want to check the role in which Cuba plays in as far as ideological training is concerned, particularly to the millions of students who are graduating there now. I'm raising this looking at the number of students who graduate from there who are South African, and the role in which they play when they are here in the country. Are they revolutionary? Are they clear as to where do they come from and what role must they then play in the country now? So the question of ideological training is what we generally have interest on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade. Thank you.
Comrade Tabang.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Chris and the ambassador and comrades there. I think, Comrade Chris, your presentation was quite fascinating. I would like to comment on that after my comment. Comrade Chris, I want to agree with the
Comrade Tabang, your line, Comrade Tabang, Comrade Tabang.
The South African student who are trained in Nigeria. Yes. Comrade Chris, can you hear me now, comrades?
Yes,
hello?
Yes, now.
Mine is bad. Is it better now?
Thank you. Thank you. Comrade, I want to agree fully with the ambassador when he was saying that the students, South African students who are trained as doctors in Cuba might be different from other doctors.
Switch off your video so that you can to improve your network. Thanks. Proceed.
Can I proceed?
Yes.
Can I proceed, comrade? Hello? Okay.
Yes, Comrade Tabang.
Yes. I want to agree with the comrade ambassador in terms of the doctors that are trained in Cuba. That the doctors in Cuba are not necessarily trained to cure the physicality of a person, but they look at the holisticness of a person, the emotional being, the physical being, and everything. We interacted with those students when we were in Cuba, and they could draw a line between the training that they are receiving in Cuba and how different is their training all over the world. Now, what they are doing also is that their training also involves the issue around the indigenous knowledge system, because when you have to the emotional part, the issue around emotional indigenous knowledge system comes into being. However, the question is, to what extent as a country are we preparing our students when they go to Cuba in terms of the emotional being that they are going to be subjected to when they are becoming doctors, not only on the medical part only, but on the emotional being part of it. The other issue, comrade, that I would also like to raise, which comrade Chris has touched on in terms of the discipline. When we were in Cuba, we were also impressed on the issue around how agriculture sustained the Cubans during their revolutionary times. And when you're looking at the GDP of the country as well, it's also 3%, if I'm not mistaken, of the country is dependent on agriculture. To what extent can we model the agricultural approach of Cuba to the South African ones? The very last comment, comrade, that I would like to do. When we were in Cuba, we saw the solidarity of the Cubans. The question that one raises is, how can we subject the youth of this country for them to visit Cuba and also to see the humanity of the Cubans and how they manage the issue of solidarity? My last take, comrade Chris, is the richness of the information that you have shared with us. But is the richness of the information reaching enough to the youth of this country so that this youth of this country can sustain the legacy and become the ambassador of the history of how Africa was liberated through the participation of the Cubans? Where does that history rest as we speak? Thank you.
Comrade Chris?
No, thank you very much, Comrade Franz. I mean, well, Comrade Geneva is right. She's correct in the sense that ours, well, together with the ambassador, I can accept and appreciate the drift and the direction in which the ambassador was coming. That it was a Cuba perspective into the African continent. And mine was also building on that drift and just maybe trying to elaborate certain aspects with a bit of detail and ideological, political underpinnings. The reality of the matter is that the post-colonial Africa has been a contradiction in itself. And that post-colonial Africa has been characterized by, among other things, Comrade Geneva, which you will appreciate also played as a contradiction and or obstacles towards a perception and or a perspective that could be developed to reciprocate assistance and or aid that Cuba directed in this way. Is that the newly founded states on the African continent were characterized by many other things, but I can maybe talk to two things. One, internal contradictions that led to coups and coup d'etats. Two, an insistence on a relationship that continues to further and deeper strengthening of the colonizer's base, if you know what I mean. So France, for example, in West Africa continues to be the dominant force in West Africa, and it plays a multiplicity of roles, including even deciding who should be presidents and or leaders of those nations. Bagbo in Ivory Coast, and etc. And the way in which it has been doing this is to create contradictions in the camps of the former national liberation movements, but also that in Africa, the Sino-Soviet schism also played a role, and that the very notion of a non-aligned movement was not to see one project in either a Soviet camp or a China camp, so to speak. So there was ambiguity for many national liberation movements on the African continent in respect of a unifying perspective as it relates to Cuba as a result of these many different contradictions that exist and continues to exist today. However, some of the progressive states nominally progressive states on the African continent have at least tried to act in defense of what exists now in terms of Cuba at a multilateral level, especially at the United Nations. The majority of the third world and the majority of African countries as such, with the exception of Morocco, have voted in favor of the uplifting of the unilateral illegal blockade of the United States against Cuba. They have also not blocked progressive resolutions that Cuba has raised in many multilateral institutions, whether it be the Human Rights Commission and others. But a lot more still needs to be done. That trade between Cuba and Africa is still nominal. Is a matter that former national liberation movement should look at very seriously. And in fact, you will understand the reason why some of us have been articulating the coming together and or cohering of what we call an African Left Network Forum is to engender this progressive notion, but also to build a better appreciation of the revolutionary process in Cuba and what Cuba has done or contributed to African national liberation and post national liberation. So at the least, we should be doing certain things. At least in South Africa, we have the Fidel Castro Nelson Mandela Health Program. But sitting here and also having evaluated this program for over the last period of time that it has been in existence, is that, and it's just my opinion, is that we have not fully exploited this program. In fact, some people in leading positions in the national liberation movement has used this project to further their own narrow personal gain. Some have even promoted and or sponsored their kids to go and study, even though those kids are not from disadvantaged communities. Some have even in today attempted, some are members of the party in Limpopo and elsewhere, trying to undermine the program itself and the Cubans deployed in our country to advance our program, our national health insurance agenda, and other progressive programs. And these are not things that are far away. Comrades in Limpopo can tell you, comrades elsewhere in the country can tell you about how we, as South Africans, have not fully imbued and understood our reciprocal responsibility to international solidarity, which was our fourth pillar of struggle. Not only to the world, the Scandinavians and etc., but also to Cuba. We have not fully appreciated that and developed the capacity and space for us to do different things. And maybe this is not the platform to take a dig at that, but these are the facts. These are Yes, at multilateral levels, yes, because at multilateral levels, yes, maybe there are no consequences of having to deal with this dissenting voice or that, and etc. Yes, we have voted for the lifting of the illegal blockade, but that is not enough. We need to be doing much more in order to appreciate. And as Samora Machel put it, that international solidarity is not an act of charity, but forces on the same side, fighting from different angles towards the same objectives and towards the same goal. And all that I'm saying is that these contradictions also in South Africa and on the African continent have limited the scope, have limited the capacity for us as Africans to further develop this relationship. Hugo Chavez, a couple of years ago, actually put in place a platform where he argued Africa-America platform should be put in place. I've got load shedding here, comrades, but I'm just going to go on, where Hugo Chavez argued for an Africa-America platform outside of the platforms of trade and others set up by the United States, such as AGOA and the EPAS of the European Partnership Agreement, that Africa needed to look away from or develop a different aspect of trade and other relations with Latin America on this platform, based upon the principles upon which we share: solidarity, fair trade, among others, and the recognition of sovereignty and a people's decision to decide on their trajectory for their countries. Not many African countries have actually participated at that platform, but we, which, if you like, brings together a big market in Latin America, from the countries of CELAC, from our Americas, from ALBA, and all of that, which brings it as a bloc to engage the African continent. And that's an opportunity. That's a space we should seek to explore. Finally, on the issue of, I reflected a little bit on the issue of the students. The ideological training of the students happens in Cuba, but you can only do this much. For example, if we take students to Cuba who come from well-off backgrounds, they will not be interested in the ideological and political issues. Theirs is to attain a profession and go into private practice and go and make money. They will not be interested, among other things, in service or selfless service as a virtue that underpins their training. As Chair spoke to university students at the University of Havana, he said, a doctor is a revolutionary and a revolutionary is a doctor, meaning the interrelationship between your profession, skills, and capacity in the benefit of society and humanity as a whole is an important aspect of appreciating that skill, that intellect, and that capacity. But what some who come from very fortunate backgrounds, who through devious ways and other things, they got onto the program, are not interested in the ideological. Yes, ideological work is done, but the Cubans cannot enforce an ideological position, for example, of training our kids to understand the NDR in Cuba. We, only us, only South Africans, and only those of us who are friends of Cuba should be articulating more forcefully and rigorously the important elements of recruiting, putting together, and selecting those who must go and study in Cuba, so that when they come back, they will understand organically their tasks, their responsibility, and will become true ambassadors of the Cuban healthcare system and also the Cuban revolutionary process. Thank you very much, camarada.
In fact, Comrade Chris, just to take that last point further, it was such an embarrassment to see how South African students were behaving in Cuba. They get an allowance which is more than the salary of a doctor in Cuba. And therefore they were using this extra allowance they're getting to display it, because they didn't want to eat the local food. They complain about they can't eat rice and everyday rice soup and so on. So clearly we're so embarrassed because it means that these people are not properly screened. Secondly, they have not been prepared to say, this is, you're not going on holiday. You're not going to Mauritius or somewhere else. You are going to study. And therefore forget about luxuries. And which is which is normal for students. We sacrifice, we sit, we eat, share food and so on. All of a sudden, our spoiled, over paid, or so to speak, embarrassed us. I know Minister Motsoaledi at one stage, who was Minister of Health, was almost in tears with what he observed and seen in Cuba. Comrades, I'm not sure if we've got just before quarter past, if there are any last takers, and I also want to invite Comrade Daniela if there are any sweeping comments you want to make before we adjourn.
I wanted to say something, but I guess I didn't know how to raise my hand. I put it on the chat room that I wanted to make a contribution.
You see, I saw that emotionally, virtually. I beg your pardon.
Okay, my name is not there. My name is Vicky Yatwego. I'm from Namibia. I just wanted to make one point. It's one that I think can be discussed further in another forum at another time. But I don't think the question is simply, are we doing enough to today to show our appreciation for all the things that Cuba has done? To me, what Cuba represents in the world today has very big implications for our countries. You follow what the US is doing. I mean, they've even reached a point where they've introduced legislation saying that sending doctors to other countries is human trafficking. I'm not saying it's going to be passed, but there's so many different onslaughts, and Cuba feels it. It's not just Cuba, it's Venezuela, it's other countries. But I think that if we imagine that the US will never give up, then we have to understand the defense of Cuba and Cuba's right to choose its socialist path is something that is directly important to all of us who are trying to work in our own countries for a different path that is not dominated by the United States and other such countries. It's something not simply a matter of gratitude, it's a matter of where the world that we want to create, what we're struggling for in our own countries, and the future and the vitality of Cuba is very much related to the fate of our own countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade. Comrade Motwali.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the inputs and would like to just reflect on a question that Comrade Fori raised, which I believe Comrade Chris was able to help reflect on it, and I think he's on the right track. But I think that a need exists in addition to the latter input, that African liberation movements and all beneficiaries of Cuba or in Cuban solidarity it's high time that something has to be done. We cannot get into this decade continuing on the same wavelength of only having a one-sided engagement. I think that in my view, a reflection of solidarity as a national value is essential, just to conscientize the nations that are led by liberation movements that solidarity is a value that has actually helped attract or benefit from Cuban goodness. And secondly, if you look at what is happening in Latin America, there's there's multiplicity of projects, whether in the academic space, in peasants movements, and so on and so forth, and even students who are advancing decoloniality projects, who are contesting the global political economy in all spaces. I think we need to find a way to probably, adapt such projects and programs that should be spread across the board, because Cuba will soon face suffocation alone while we probably continue standing and applauding. I think reciprocity is an extremely urgent project that needs to be explored and initiated and implemented as a matter of extreme urgency. Agriculture could be one area where we don't only visit Cuba, but also get Cubans to come and help us empower communities that have got land, but they don't know what to do with the little resources they have. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Daniela, are you in? You want to give you an opportunity to say something?
Comrade Franz?
Hello?
Comrade Franz?
Yes, Comrade Chris?
I just wanted to say that after Daniela, if you could just give me half a minute or so.
Yes. Okay. Comrade Daniela?
Thank you very much.
Are you in? Is Comrade Daniela still there?
Yes, she is still here. She's just muted. So she needs to unmute.
Yeah, she's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Comrade Che, for the brilliant presentation. I have to renounce that this is also a lesson for me, because you are witness of the history that I'm know through the books and studies. So it's very touching to see from your words, warm, and gratifying to see the appreciation of the Cuban contribution, to see how you think that you can do a lot of things more to support Cuba, and is impressive for me, because in Cuba we feel that the Africans are our brothers. We have seen so many examples of your support to Cuba, the support that we need in the moment when we most need support, and stand by Cuba in this right now difficult moment. Is very important for us now when the world is facing an unprecedented crisis due to this health emergency of the COVID-19. When the actions of the United States government is tightening the sanctions against Cuba, doing even harder for the Cubans to obtain food, to obtain medicines, to obtain essential supplies for the hospitals. So, comrades, don't think that you are not doing so much for us. We are very grateful for all the support of the African continent towards Cuba. Very grateful for your support in defense of our auto-determination, for our sovereignty, for that is, I agree with the comrade that mentioned that the support to Cuba for those rights that we have as a people is the respect also for the rights of all the peoples in the world, the right that all the peoples have to define the way, the path, and I ratify that the contribution of Cuba to the African liberation that will have a continuation for all the years in the future was a moral duty for the Cubans, for all the elements that the ambassador mentioned, and because Cuba and Africa have a tie that cannot be destroyed by anyone. I agree also with the comrade Chris when he was speaking about the 60s, when was the decade when Cuba opened to the world to help a lot of countries, mainly Africa, but also other countries in Latin America, all other movements in this part of the world, hosting the Tricontinental Conference, the No Aligned movement. But that is something that we in those first years of the revolution, we learned from the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz, that we in those moments when we were in a very difficult years of the revolution, facing diplomatic isolation, facing political isolation, facing even a military intervention launched by the United States, even in those moments, we decide to share, we decide to have the solidarity as a flag of a revolution. That was always a legacy of the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz, that the legacy that I can ratify today as a young lady from the young generations from Cuba, that we learned that spirit to share. In those moments, Cuban people learn, and right now, Cuban conduction of the revolution, the new leaders, and also the young generation in Cuba feel the same commitment to continue this relation with our African brothers. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to remember his legacy. Just a week after the commemoration of 94th anniversary of the birth of Fidel Castro Ruz, I just wanted to try him to also to this conversation, because I feel very comfortable, because it's been a space to share ideas, and also for me to learn about our history and to be more proud and ratify that Cuba will be, Cuba won't renounce, even now that we have facing a difficult moment in our country economically and facing the tightening of the blockade. Cuba won't renounce one of our principles, one of our spirit, that is a legacy of Fidel. Thank you again for this space, comrades. That is very important for us. Amanda.
Thank you. Amanda, how are you? Thanks, Comrade Daniela. We will physically visit the embassy post this. Now we're already at level 2. Yes. It's always home when we visit the embassy. We get
Cuban coffee for you. Cuban coffee.
Yeah, Cuban coffee or mojito, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Much better, yeah. Comrade, let me ask Comrade Chris. I beg your pardon?
No, Comrade. Yeah, no, Comrade Franz. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I mean, on this webinar, we are joined by comrades from sub-Saharan Africa, not only Southern Africa, from as far away as Kenya, and we have comrades from Namibia, the wife of former Comrade Vicky, who spoke earlier on. We also have comrades, I think, in the main, who are part of the solidarity associations and movements in their countries. And so, in some respects, if you like, this is a African expression of solidarity with Cuba. Secondly, we have this process of hosting, again, as part of expressing our solidarity from a people-to-people relations, a biannual, every 2 years. How do you call that?
Yes,
every
biannual.
2 years, a biannual Africa conference, an Africa conference, biannual Africa conference that takes place, hosted by a solidarity association. The last one was held in Abuja, Nigeria, sometime last year, November or September, I think. And the next one is going to be held in Mozambique. And it is for this reason. Another one was also held just before Abuja. It was in Windhoek, Namibia. I'm pointing this out in order to also just infuse those are the important plank of relationship with Cuba, the people-to-people relations. And through that, we should be able to conscientize more people, draw into our ranks a better understanding of Cuba, and appreciate Cuba's role for our peoples, for our project, and that we must build the Cuba Friendship Associations where we live, where we stay, building a patriotic, building a internationalist, progressive front. Muito obrigada. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias. Comrade Jenny.
Comrade Franz, from my side, just a brief indication that this is the first of what we are intending to do in terms of internationalism and solidarity to ensure that we've got a monthly webinar going forward. And we welcome the participation of all of the comrades involved in tonight's session. And we hope that as we move forward, we will deepen our understanding of solidarity issues in our continent, primarily, and in the South, and be able to ensure that we build and deepen our understanding. I think for me, the contributions that have been made in the chat room, we will save so that we are able to also ensure that it informs our international solidarity program going forward and doesn't remain just at the level of a very profoundly important sharing of knowledge and information and analysis. Back to you to close.
Thank you, Comrade Jenny. Not sure. I think Colin Clark, are you covered?
No, I'm fine.
All right, colleagues. Thank you very much. Special thanks to the ambassador and the embassy team, Comrade Chris, for preparing and making this input, and to all for your participation. I was not aware, Comrade Chris. Thanks for bringing to our attention our comrades coming from Sub-Sahara, Kenya, Namibia, and other comrades in the Solidarity Association with Cuba. Sometimes materially does not suggest love, but acts can indicate how committed we are in a relationship. And therefore, by various acts, remembering Commander-in-Chief, remembering various struggle epochs in Cuba, it can be a good sign and motivating, including with Quito Carnival, the role they've played. With that, comrade, thank you very much, and also for agreeing to extend the time beyond the agreed time of 6 o'clock. We adjourn. See you next month. Amandla.
Away to. Long live.